Welcome, everybody. So I'm Jake. As Beth gave me this introduction, I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow in Midas. I'm also affiliated with paleontology and seas. I'm really an evolutionary biologist, but as my career has progressed, I'm becoming more and more of a sort of a biodiversity data scientist, which means that I think about all sorts of types of biodiversity data, from genetic to sort of spatial to phenotype, and I try to understand them in sort of big and broad strokes. So this presentation is going to be in 3 parts today, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get to this last part where we'll have some interactive components playing with ChatGPT or large language models. Where you will be able to try to apply some of the things that I'm going to teach you, or hopefully teach you. So the first part is going to be a little bit about me and my background, my experience with data visualization in general, and how I think about generative AI. That I think is going to be really important for those of you who are new to using generative AI tools. That's really more. So this presentation is less on the technical side of things because really the most that we can get out of using these tools comes from our individual sort of interactions with these tools. It's kind of hard to, it's often hard to generalize because everyone kind of has their own experience in how they use these tools. But I'm going to give you my impression of what I think about them to try to help you think about them as well. Second part, we're going to talk about how I use generative AI tools to write functions in R. So this is going to be geared to people with some R experience, but if you don't have experience with R, you should be able to just follow along and still understand something about the process that I'm using. So basically there's this new kind of paradigm that people are calling prompt-gramming, which is a kind of a synergistic programming with language models as an assistant. And this is kind of the philosophy that I take. And then in this third part, we're going to do these data challenges. So if we have time, we'll have some challenges for you guys to see if we can build use some of these tools that I'm going to talk about. So a little bit of my background. As I said, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I actually started off as a field biologist. Here's a picture of me almost 10 years exactly working in the Amazonian rainforest in Manaus. So that's actually right there where the mouse is. Oh, you can't see the mouse. It's right in the middle of Brazil. And I got started as a biologist working on these really charismatic groups of birds. These on the left, these are a group of birds called manakins, and then on the right, a group of birds called cotingas. They're kind of like the neotropical South American birds of paradise. They have these really flamboyant behaviors, colors, super interesting biology, and that kind of got me into biology I wanted to travel South America, do a lot of field work, see these things, study them in the wild. But as my career progressed, I became more and more of a data scientist and spread out beyond birds. And now I study quite a large portion of the tree of life. So mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and even deep sea invertebrates recently. This is all kind of ongoing work. This talk is not about my work, so this is just in case if anyone's interested in these topics or wants to learn more about these things or talk to me about it, please do so. In my actual research now, the main topics that I'm interested in concern these sort of 4 domains. Phylogeny, which is sort of the reconstruction of the tree of life. How do we do that? What are the best practices for how do we study the tree of life? Biogeography, so that's like the evolution of life in time and space, physical space on planet Earth. Diversification, which is the process by which species propagate and diversify. And then phenotype, which is just the physical form of biodiversity. So these 4 domains kind of comprise my research program. And recently, I've been getting much more into using AI tools in my own research. And we've now developed a system with some collaborators to basically take museum specimens of skeletons and use computer vision to basically measure the whole skeleton all at once, automatically figure out what the bones are, measure them, and spit out a data set. So as part of the position that I'm in now, I'm working with this system that we're calling Skelevision, which is going to basically revolutionize our ability to collect huge amounts of data from museum collections. So this is all super fun stuff. I also spent a lot of time thinking about data visualization, and so that's the theme of this presentation. So in this intro, I've just picked some of my favorite visualizations that I've made over the years. I'm going to slow down because I speak fast. So on the left is just a depiction of the evolutionary relationships among the species in this group of birds called the cotingas, that group that I showed you before. When I made this 10 years ago, I literally went into the bird guide and took pictures with my phone and then converted them to like Illustrator or Photoshop files, and then replaced everything manually by hand. That took a long time to make. And on the other side is a much bigger figure that I generated for a different paper. Most of these, so like 80% of this is done in R, and then the last mile is done in Illustrator, typically. I also think about visualizing biodiversity data in physical space. So here's a picture of a map that I made for a paper that came out a couple years ago. This wasn't using R, this was using something called QGIS, which is a completely free piece of software. And all of this was made with free resources. So if you're interested in this type of data visualization, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. This took me months to make this. Some other data visualization types that I think about. So I'm not going to go into any technical details, but this is just to show you some examples. This on the left side is a picture of how genetic variation or population genetic variation maps onto physical space. And then on the right is a picture of how the vocalizations of these birds map onto physical space as well. So these are sonograms that we make from recordings of the birds singing. Here's another example from some recent stuff that's still in review. These are just examples. So if anyone is interested in this particular aesthetic or style of visualization, I'd be very happy to talk about how to make figures that look like this. I know we're not going to go into the science, but one of my main inspirations for data visualization comes from this book, which if you're making any kind of figures in science, you should, if not own this book, know about it and be able to be familiar with it. It sort of outlines a really nice. It includes a beautiful history of like data visualization across hundreds of years, and also sort of outlines a theory for how to think about the aesthetics of data visualization. Very famous book. How many of you know this book? I'm curious. Okay, so some of you know it. Have any of you never heard of this before? Oh, great. Yeah, definitely look at this book. This is a fantastic book. It's worth owning, I think, but it's definitely worth looking at. Okay, so as I said, I mostly use R in my work, and really the last 10% I've been using Illustrator, and sometimes these other free tools like QGIS or Inkscape. I don't use Inkscape very much, but Inkscape is a free alternative to Adobe Illustrator if anyone wants to look that up. So as I said, I basically have been thinking as a biodiversity data scientist using a lot of these open source tools for more than a decade. And then November 2022 happens and the world changes. And OpenAI releases ChatGPT, the first to market with this large language model tool. And actually, I guess it's more than a year now. But really, in less than a year, it completely changed the way that I do science, the way that I do everything, basically, as a data scientist. And at this point, there's really no point. We're past the point of no return, I think, at least for my own work. So I'm curious, how many of you have actually, I assume most of you have used ChatGPT or a large language model before. Has anyone never used one before? You never used one, wow, cool. Okay, so this will be fun for you. Do most people use ChatGPT or other, so who uses ChatGPT specifically? And what about UMGPT, the UM version? And what about the Llama 3? Anyone use Llama 3? Okay. And any other open source models that are smaller, maybe? Gemini? People use Gemini, Google's version? Okay, cool. So mostly ChatGPT. Do most of you own a license? Like, do you pay for the pro version or do you use the free version? So who pays for ChatGPT? Sometimes. And but most of you use the free version? And raise your hand if you're using the free version currently. Okay, cool. So that should be fine for what we're doing today. It's good to sort of see who's using what. Okay, so just very brief overview of what these things are doing. A lot of what I'm going to be describing is kind of using metaphors to describe very technical things, because this is not about how these things actually work under the hood. This is more about how do we think about how to use these and sort of the practical side of like applying these things to your research or to your projects. So these, for both images and for text generation, a lot of these tools are built on this thing called autoencoder framework, autoencoders. There are different versions of that are used for different flavors of this, but the basic idea, at least, so in the top row I have the image example here for image generation. So if you put in a text prompt, so if the text is a corgi playing a flame-throwing trumpet, that goes into like a text encoder, which looks at the text and tries to compress that down to its semantic content, so the meaning of those words, using a sophisticated approach. This gets compressed into what's called the latent space, which is this semantic sort of hyperdimensional space in that the computer, that allows the computer to sort of query the semantic content of that input. This then gets passed to an image, to a decoding chunk, and this is what actually generates the image. So it goes from the semantic content, this compressed space that contains the meaning of the prompt, and then it gets decoded into into an image. A similar process happens for text, at least it did for the first version of this. So for the paper that described basically this paper from Google that allows this basically that described the transformer technology that allows this to be possible. It uses an autoencoder framework that has an encoder and a decoder side of this. And it was originally in the paper, they talk about using this for translation tasks, so like translating French to English or German to English or whatever. And this autoencoder framework is very useful for that. But it turns out that if you're just doing chat-based conversation, that just using the decoder part of this is enough. And it does sort of both the semantic representation and then the decoding to the output all in one sort of step. It's a lot faster this way. And this paper was published in 2020. And this is the paper that described GPT 3.0. So there's a slight difference, doesn't really matter, but the main companies that are building the commercial versions of these are OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic. There are a few others, but these are kind of the ones that are getting the most attention. OpenAI, of course, runs this thing called ChatGPT. They also have DALL-E, which is what they use for image generation, and then the most recent thing is called Sora, which is for video generation. I'm curious, how many of you have seen the examples of Sora? Okay, if you haven't seen Sora, that's absolutely worth looking up because it's crazy. It's like put in a text and you get like an HD video, like a film, like a cinematography, perfect cinematography, like a beautiful video out the other end. That's not available yet and may never be, but it exists. Google has their version of this called Gemini, which is their framework for both images and text. And then Anthropic has a series of models called Claude of different sophistication. And all three of these are great. I don't have a strong opinion on who's the best or whatever. I basically have been using ChatGPT and OpenAI mostly because they got there first, and I kind of jumped on that wagon in November of 2022, and haven't really felt a need to explore these others quite yet. But I have friends who use Claude and say it's fantastic for writing, and so I have no strong opinion on which one you should use. However, I will mention that there is a lot of open source versions of these models too. And if you are running a decently powerful laptop, really anything from the last couple of years, you actually can run these models on your laptop locally. And I have Llama 3, which is a pretty big model running on this laptop that I'm presenting from right now. And if we have time at the end, I can show an example of that, of the model running 100% on my computer. But these are some important websites to know about. This website called Hugging Face is kind of becoming like the GitHub, but for deep learning. So like if you have a big model that you've built, like a language model or an image model, and you want to make it publicly available, you go to Hugging Face and you can put it up there and make it accessible to the world. And so a lot of these open source models are being put on this Hugging Face website. There's another website called lmsys.org, which is like an independent, it's actually run by Berkeley. I think it's run by students at Berkeley, that is basically ranks the performance of these models. So if you go to this website, you'll get a picture that looks like this. Oh, sorry, I'm realizing that you can't see my mouse. Oops. Like this chart here. that has a ranking of all the models, both commercial and non-commercial. So you can filter it by non-commercial if you're curious about which ones are the best non-commercial models. It turns out that so Facebook or Meta has been putting enormous resources into building open source versions of these language models. They're spending like $10 billion to train these models, and they're giving them away for free, which is quite extraordinary. And this Llama 3 model, which I have running on my computer here, is about, it's somewhere between GPT 3.5 and 4 in its intelligence, so it's very good. And it's completely free, and you can run it on your laptop. And very soon there will be models that will be running on your phones that are not quite as powerful, but will have substantial capabilities. If you want to run these models on your computer, I recommend this program called LM Studio, which is also a completely free program. If you go to lmstudio.ai, download the app, and then within this unified interface allows you to sort of query the Hugging Face repository and download all sorts of different open source models. There's a whole ecosystem of these open source models now that are available. Yeah, it's super fun to play with. I can show a demo of this at the end if we end up having time. Okay, am I going too fast, or is this like a good pace? Yeah, okay, cool. So U of M also really did an amazing thing when they released UMGPT for the community. My understanding, at least on my sort of maybe slightly inside knowledge understanding, is that part of the thinking with this is that they didn't want, when OpenAI started charging for their pro version of ChatGPT, they didn't want there to be a serious equity issue between students who could just pay for the license and have access to this high performance model and students that couldn't do that. And so that was part of the thinking in building this kind of infrastructure for the community. Not all of it, but I thought that was really a nice move. Right now, as of a few days ago, there are some limits on what you can use for this. I think the limits are a little bit more restricted than they used to be, I think. It's about 25 prompts per hour, which is good if you're not using it like a crazy person like I do. But yeah, and you can access really some of the most sophisticated models that are available, GPT 3.5 and 4. As far as I know, they don't yet have 4.0, which is the newest version from OpenAI. They also have available Llama 2, but not the Llama 3. So Llama 2 is the precursor to the new Llama 3 model from Meta. So anyone with a login should be able to access this. It's really great, and I actually use this. So often when I'll be using ChatGPT, I'll hit the rate limit, and I'll switch over to UMGPT, and it's basically just as good. So it's like you're not making any really any compromise by using UMGPT if that's a thought that you've had. Yeah, recently they've also enabled this DALL-E image generation, which I haven't played with through UMGPT. But anyway, this is a fantastic resource for UM affiliates. I definitely encourage you to use it. So if you're using the free version of ChatGPT, UMGPT is going to be way more powerful than that, because this gives you access to GPT-4, which is the higher tier, which is a much more powerful model. So if you've only used the free version of ChatGPT, I highly recommend trying out UMGPT, because it's really GPT-4 is quite a lot smarter, and you should, if you use that for a little while, you'll know what I mean. Okay, so a little bit of a conceptual step back for a second. So I said earlier that I want to sort of convey how I think about these things, because I think that will help everyone kind of help everyone kind of think about how to apply these things, and when can we use these and when shouldn't we use these things. And so I think understanding this, what they're trying to do is really important. So this metaphor that I've come up with I'm calling it semantic interpolation. I don't know if somebody's used that metaphor before, but I think this is a really helpful metaphor. And so what do I mean by this? So I think as we move towards artificial general intelligence, which is kind of what you might imagine like a science fiction AI might be, thinking of this as the first step in that path, I think is going to be very helpful. So let's think about this. So if we think of these models, both the language models and the image models, as sort of an interpolation machine, what do I mean by this? So if we put into the prompt a corgi playing a flame-throwing trumpet, that goes into this black box system into this space called the latent space. It then gets decomposed into these concepts, right? So maybe like the concept of a dog, and the concept of fire, and the concept of playfulness maybe, and then these concepts of like music and instruments, and then it gets extrapolated or interpolated. Basically, those concepts get interpolated somewhere in this space, and then it spits out this wonderful image of a corgi playing the trumpet. So the idea here is that you're kind of trying to find not just the intermediate point between a set of like numbers, but you're actually finding the intermediate point between among a set of concepts, and that's the real thing that's like fundamentally different about these models than what we've been able to do before. So yeah, this capacity was really only available to human brains before. The idea of being able to do this kind of conceptual interpolation, semantic interpolation. So can you guys think, what's like an example of like a task that would be a human brain task that would be like a conceptual interpolation? Anybody have any ideas? Anything, any domain. Sorry?
Like painting pictures.
Yeah, sure, painting, yeah, for sure. So like if you have like, you want to paint an image of multiple topics, and you have to interpolate what those things look like together. Yeah, perfect. Any other thoughts? Maybe not, maybe more on the sort of like analytical side of things. Visually mapping, sure, yeah. Maybe like trying to come up with a hypothesis that explains two different phenomena together, or drawing from two different disciplines, the concepts of two different disciplines to try to explain a third discipline, right? Those kinds of conceptual linkages are really something that only our brains could do until these tools came out. And I actually asked ChatGPT-4 to come up with some examples of human, examples of this kind of cognitive semantic interpolation, and it gave me these beautiful examples that are like way better than anything I could come up with. So like contextual understanding. So like the brain effectively interpolates missing information based on pieces of information that it hears. Creativity and idea generation. So combining elements from seemingly unrelated areas to create innovative solutions. Definitely does that. Polysemy. So I didn't even know what this word meant until yesterday when I was looking this up. So this is like when words have multiple meanings in different contexts. These models can figure that out, no problem, based on the context in which you make your query, which is amazing. They can predict the ends of sentences. So fundamentally, these models are built as next token prediction models. So they predict like the next word in the sequence of the input. That's how they were originally designed, and I have some content about that a little bit later. It does that really well. And then learning from sparse information. So for example, if you give it, let's see, when learning a new skill or subject, humans can perform semantic interpolation by connecting new information with pre-existing knowledge. For instance, a student learning about economic supply and demand might relate it to personal experiences with scarcity. Okay, so bridging conceptual gaps, that's a little bit more nebulous, but the others are, I think, very good. So let's think about this semantic interpolation in terms of visualization. So when I first got access to the image generating tools, I immediately started playing with some crazy ideas. So I'm going to show some of my favorite examples. The first thing I wanted to do was see if I could insert Muppets into Lord of the Rings, because I love both of these things. and so how well do you think it accomplished this task? It did it extremely well. So yeah. I lost a lot of time doing this. Yeah, this is wonderful. So, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. So it's semantic interpolation. So it's taking totally different conceptual universes and finding the sort of conceptual union of those two totally different aesthetic and conceptual universes. So it does this extremely well. I love this little vignette on the side. So actually, when I gave it up, when I was playing with this, I was amazed that it actually spit out this comic book strip on its own. I didn't even ask for a comic book strip, and then I started, incorporating that into my prompts, and ended up with something like this. And so ended up with basically like the adventures of Cookie Monster in this Lord of the Rings universe. So Yeah. Of course, you can also take this in a slightly different direction, get a little more spooky, more, I don't know what you'd call this. You can also go a lot bigger in scale. This is one of my favorite things. So if you actually have access to the paid version of ChatGPT, I turn this into a custom GPT that anyone can use. So if you go to this URL, you can type in a prompt and get a narrative, a story, and an image, like one of these images, if anyone would like to play with this. It draws on like Lovecraftian, themes basically. So it spits out some kind of creepy stuff, but it's really been super fun to play with this. Yeah, but my main point here is that this is not, so like, this is mostly just to get you thinking about like this idea of like semantic interpolation, like conceptual interpolation, because it does this extremely well. It does other things very poorly. This has become a problem in the scientific literature already. So you might be, these tools are incredibly powerful. They can make these beautiful images. And you might be tempted to try to use these tools to make figures for your projects or your scientific publications. Don't do this yet, for sure. Maybe someday. Do not do this currently. Don't do this. Please don't do this. Just say no. Don't do it. You can't do it. And I'll show you a good example of why this is a terrible idea. So in February, I don't know if you folks have know about what I'm about to show you, but prepare yourselves. So this paper was published in one of the Frontiers journals, Cellular Functions of Spermatogonial Stem Cells in Relation to the JAK-STAT Signaling Pathway. So the authors of this paper decided to, rather than design conceptual figures themselves, they asked Midjourney, which is another piece of software, to do this image generation. And it generated an image like this. So I'm just going to leave this up here for a few seconds for you to kind of digest it. If you know anything about cell signaling, or if you don't know anything about that, this is not going to mean anything to you. But if you do know anything about that, this is gibberish, basically. But it looks nice, right? So it looks kind of like a cell signaling diagram, kind of cartoony, but it's just complete gibberish. And this was published in a peer-reviewed publication. However, if we think about what I've been talking about, this idea of like semantic conceptual interpolation, this is not a failure of the model. This is a failure of the operator, right? The model is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. I don't know what prompt they gave this, whatever they used, Midjourney, but it's taking different concepts that were clearly in the prompt, and it's finding this conceptual interpolation of what it thinks, how to make sense of those different concepts. And of course, this paper was retracted after a huge outcry on social media. There was another figure in this paper that I'm also going to show you that I think is really what kind of alerted people to this problem. There it is. So this was in a published figure. I actually downloaded the PDF. I saved the PDF in case it's ever taken down. It's on the GitHub repository for this workshop. But yeah, this is gibberish. And of course, it got excoriated on social media. And within a couple of days, there were people doing baking projects, and whatever. So yeah, don't do this, because you'll be found out and you will be excoriated, basically. So don't do this. We can't do this yet, because these models are not smart enough to do this kind of thing. So I'll leave you with this thought. Why does this work for art but not for science? I actually don't have a full answer for this, but I wonder. But does anyone have any thoughts on why this might be the case? Sure, for sure. You mean if someone's trying to make a specific description of something and it doesn't quite match it exactly? For sure. For sure. Yeah. So, but in this, in the example of the cellular pathway, I kind of already gave you the answer, right? It's kind of because it's doing this conceptual interpolation, right? It's not actually, it doesn't really fully understand the content of the image, but it's finding this it's trying to find this representation of the meaning, and then it's finding this interpolated spot in this latent space, and then it's pulling out from that. So in that sense, it works. If you want to put Muppets into Lord of the Rings, it works fantastically well. Or if you want to blend different genres or find things which I think are actually genuine creative acts, right? If you're trying to find the intersection between two very different aesthetic spaces, I think that's creativity. That's my opinion, but so it works very well for that. But if you want to make a schematic or a scientific diagram, don't do this yet. It does not work. However, there are things that it can do for data visualization that are really, really helpful. So in order to understand this, we have to think a little bit beyond interpolation and think about the emergent properties of some of these models. So as the scale of these models has increased, we've discovered, actually I think this is you could call this scientific discovery, that these models have emergent properties that we don't really understand. And these are very sophisticated abilities that really have only been attributable to human brains previously. So language understanding, one of the craziest things that it can do is explain memes. So if there's a meme that you don't know or get, you can give it a picture of a meme and it'll explain why it's funny and what the context is. And it understands humor. It can write code. So that's actually what we're going to end up talking about. But this is a kind of an emergent property of these models. So when I was putting together this presentation, I found this nice blog post by a developer at a company called Assembly AI, and he talks about these emergent properties, and he says we don't know at what scale they will appear, meaning we don't know how big does a model have to be to get some kind of emergent property. We don't know their ability until they appear, until those emergent properties appear, and we don't know the landscape of potential abilities. So we're kind of uncharted territory when it comes to figuring out what these things will be capable of doing and when they will be capable of doing them. I have this little video on here. Hopefully I'll be able to play audio. Is that possible? Is it possible to play audio? Okay. This is a video of Ilya Sutskever, who's one of the founders of OpenAI. Oops.
Looks like on the surface.
Oh. It's actually not playing here. I wonder if there's a way. Oop. Let's see. I'll just play the audio if I can't get the video working. It should be embedded in here, but oops.
I challenge the claim that next token prediction cannot surpass human performance. It looks like on the surface it cannot. Mm-hmm. It looks on the surface if you just learn to imitate, to predict what people do, it means that you can only copy people. But here is a counter argument for why it might not be quite so. If your base neural net is smart enough, you just ask it what would a person with great insight and wisdom and capability do? Maybe such a person doesn't exist, but there's a pretty good chance that the neural net will be able to extrapolate how such a person should behave. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, although where would it get that sort of insight about what that person would do, if not from?
From the data of regular people. Because if you think about it, what does it mean to predict the next token well enough? What does it mean actually? It's a deeper question than it seems. Predicting the next token well means that you understand the underlying reality that led to the creation of that token. It's not statistics, it is statistics, but what is statistics? In order to understand those statistics, to compress them, you need to understand what is it about the world that creates those statistics. And so then you say, okay, well, I have all those people. What is it about people that creates their behaviors? Well, they have, they have thoughts and they have feelings and they have ideas and they do things in certain ways. All of those could be deduced from next token prediction. And I'd argue that this should make it possible, not indefinitely, but to a pretty decent degree, to say, well, can you guess what you'd do if you took a person with this characteristic and that characteristic? Such a person doesn't exist. But because you're so good at predicting the next token, you should still be able to guess what that person would do, this hypothetical, imaginary person with far greater mental ability than the rest of us.
Okay. So that's kind of the, so Ilya he's kind of known for making these kind of like sci-fi kinds of soapbox statements, but I think that there's some truth to what he's saying in the sense that in order for these models to work as well as they do, they have to understand something about the underlying reality of the content that they're generating, and we're in this weird space now where we don't understand where these emergent properties are coming from, which is also potentially dangerous. But in the meantime, we can still try to use these tools in our work, take advantage of these emergent properties. So the main thing that we're going to talk about today in the actual practical part of this is how these things can write code and how we can use these things to write code to help with data visualization. The previous part of the talk is basically my soapbox part of this, so like that's mostly over now. But I hope that's, I wanted to talk about that just to kind of give you an overview of how I'm thinking about these models and what I think so I think if you for the most part think of these models in terms of this idea of like semantic interpolation, then that will orient you in terms of what types of questions and what types of tasks you can actually do well with it, right? It's not going to do super well if you ask it to do something that's way outside of what you can do with sort of semantic interpolation. But you can do a lot with that, plus the emergent properties that these things can do. So, for example, don't use it to make figures that you try to get published. Don't do that. It does that. This is an area where it fails very poorly. So in terms of writing code and data visualization in general, I think that these tools provide like an extraordinary equalizing opportunity for folks who may not have a super technical background. So if you want to get into writing code for data analysis or data visualization, and you have some idea of what you'd want to do and how you want to analyze or visualize something, and you have some basic ideas, basic understanding of how the code should work, you really only need a very low baseline of knowledge to be able to leverage these tools and then boost yourself 100-fold in terms of your actual what you can actually do. And so yeah, I think this is gonna provide. So one thing that I'm particularly excited about as someone who started as a field biologist, when I started off, so I've become much more technical over the course of my career. But when I started, I was not a computer science major. I didn't learn coding until after I graduated college, basically. If I'd had this tool 10 years ago, it would have exponentially accelerated the rate at which I was able to learn how to do that. So let's talk about code. So this idea of semantic interpolation again. So if you ask ChatGPT or some language model to write an R function that will do some task for you, it goes into this latent space and it leverages all this knowledge that it knows about how to write code, concepts of object-oriented programming, for example, and it has this emergent property to logically, piece together the steps, the syntax in a way that should most of the time work. And this is a property that comes out of this semantic interpolation sort of baseline, but it does seem to be kind of an emergent property. We don't really understand how it's able to do this so well, as far as I understand. For those of you that have been using this for a while, you'll know that prompting is really important, and how you prompt and how you talk to these AIs really makes a huge difference. This paper was just came out a few days ago, and it's actually sort of a quantification of different prompting strategies and how well they actually improve the output. And they found that when using some systematic strategies, you can get huge improvements in the quality of the output, like up to 50%. They quantified this in a standard sort of array. This paper is also on the supplement, is on the GitHub for this workshop. So they actually put out in the paper this list of 26 specific prompts that people can play with that they've measured to make major improvements. I don't expect you to read that. I'll show you some examples. And the slides will also be available. So this idea of like what is the magic spell to like get the output that you want has inspired people to build software packages. So like this is an example of this prompt enhancer that it is itself based on a large language model, but it has been trained with all the tricks of prompting. This is just one example. So you give it a prompt, like a default prompt that you might be asking, and then it'll take your prompt and it'll turn it into a prompt that should be more effective based on all these different prompting strategies. So for example, two of my favorites from this are like, I will tip you $200 for a better solution, or this is very important to my career. That's amazing that actually makes a difference, but apparently it does. I think this is less true of the very recent models, but about 6 months ago, that definitely made a difference. I know from personal experience. And every prompt I would write, I would say, I'll tip you $200 or $1,000 if you know. Or you can say things, or I would say things like, I need you to write the full solution because I have no fingers, or something like that. and that works. Like it actually interprets. It takes you literally, and it would try harder, anecdotally. Okay. So all this stuff about prompting is really important. But we're about 45 minutes in, so I thought maybe we'd take a short break if anyone needs to use the restroom or ask any questions. Yeah, maybe 5-10 minutes. Let's say 10 minutes exactly, and then we'll go into the second half and we'll do the the interactive part. Does that work? Yeah, go for it.
What's the advantage of running a model on your computer just for data privacy?
So there's data privacy. It's completely free. That's the main thing. Yeah, so if you have a computer that's powerful enough, which is really, if you have an M1 series, any Mac with an M series chip, so any Mac within the last 2-3 years, like not even high end, even the low end, even like the low end sort of M series Macs will be able to run one of these models, even one of these models. And most PCs too will be able to run these models, but maybe not the bigger models. So my laptop, for example, this has a lot of system memory because I do a lot of heavy computation on this. But this laptop, which is like a consumer product, can run the biggest Llama 3 model that's available for consumers, the 70 billion parameter model, and it runs it fast enough to actually use it, which is amazing that it actually will run locally. So using this LM Studio software, so it's also useful for if you're a software developer developing tools to use language models. It's useful to be able to run one of these models on your own machine, because then you can set up like an API and write software queries that will interact. So you can, like, for example, set up a server in your lab that's running a language model that you can then query and have complete control over. And it's and in that case, it would be completely free to you as a researcher, rather than having to pay OpenAI for their API access or Google or whatever. So that's the main thing. It's also really, if you're an AI researcher, it's really valuable to be able to download these models and actually dissect them, because you can go in and you can actually retrain them. You can do all sorts of stuff. So there's both practical and sort of more developmental. More like commercial sides, even for the open source models. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or main concept is the data confidentiality.
Sure.
Is that when you say local, you really everything's local?
100%.
Not passing anything to the cloud?
Yep. 100%. Yeah. So if you run Llama 3, on your local machine or on a server, there's no data. You don't need any internet connection. You could be on an airplane at 35,000 feet, no internet, and run these models on your computer.
And nothing will pass out.
Nothing. It's completely correct. Yeah. Yeah. And so if you remove if you erase the chat, then it's gone after that. There's no memory, as far as I know. Yeah, because it's running on your local GPU and system memory. So. And the other advantage to the open source approach is that a developer can go in and actually confirm that that's the case, right? You can confirm that it's not actually going to make a secret message to the server or to some other website or whatever. And you can, if you're not a computer scientist, you wouldn't be able to do that. But but people in the community would determine that was the case or not the case. And but since the Llama 3 models are made by Meta, by Facebook, and so they're more or less a reputable company, and so we can assume that the model is doing approximately what they tell us it's doing. And so, I would not worry about that. If I had some data privacy concerns, if I was running Llama 3 on my machine, I personally would have no concerns about that information getting leaked or going back to them to further training or anything like that. And yeah, if you're interested in that, we can definitely talk about that, about how to do that. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Do you want to take 5 minutes and then, so like what time is it? We have 10:46, so like maybe like 10:50, that's 4 minutes. Or let's say 10:55, we'll come back and we'll do the second half. Does that sound good to everybody? Take a short break? Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna hang around, so if anybody has more questions about the stuff I've talked about, we can chat. Oops. Cool. Okay, everybody good to go for the next part? Yeah? Okay, so here are my top prompting tips for writing code with language models. Basically, so I'm going to go through these one by one, but what I would say, really the best thing I would advise is use the models for the task that you're trying to accomplish. It's going to take you between 15 and 20 hours of of effort to really get a sense of like what it can do for you. And so that's really the number one thing is like the best way to learn how to use these models is to use them. And if you don't understand something, you just ask, please explain this thing, and it'll explain it. But the reason I say it takes this amount of time is because everyone thinks slightly differently, and the way that you're going to interact with one of these models is going to be slightly different from the way everyone else interacts with these models, just like you would interact with another person. And so it takes some time to develop kind of that rapport, basically, with ChatGPT 4 or whatever. But they're slightly, whichever one you're using is going to be slightly different. And so I would say that it takes probably maybe 10, 12 hours to develop a general intuition, but really 15 to 20 hours to really understand, like to get a really good understanding of how these models will be useful to you. There's a really nice book published a few weeks ago called Co-Intelligence by I think he's a Wharton professor, Ethan Malik. I recommend this book. I've been going through this. I think I'm mostly finished with it, but this is a really nice introduction to. He kind of has a nice he also uses some nice metaphors to kind of explain what he thinks how we should be using these models and how we should be thinking about them and how it's going to change the way we work. But for prompting, and specifically for I mean, I think this is useful for most tasks, but for code specifically, number one thing, break down complex tasks into a sequence of simpler steps. That's really one of the most important things. And I'm going to show an example of this, of building up this kind of chain of thought prompting. Another is using examples. So you can say, okay, here's an input and my desired output. An example of what I want is the output. And you can give a few of those within one prompt. And I'm not going to do that exactly, but I'll show you an example of what I mean. That helps. Using words like think step by step or explain your reasoning to me step by step as part of your prompt often really, really helps in building up this sort of composite chain of thought prompt. And then using delimiters between sections. This is less important, but if you put like little carets or hashtags or whatever between sections of your prompt, that also seems to help a little bit in terms of keeping this different. If you have a prompt with multiple sections, that's quite useful. But really, the most important thing is thinking about the question that you're asking and breaking it down into a series of simpler steps that can then be combined later on. Especially for programming, I find this really, really helpful. So, yeah, let's talk about language models for data visualization and specifically for writing R functions for plotting. So if you have been using R for a while, at some point you'll start writing your own R functions, but it takes different amounts. Sometimes people never end up writing their own functions. They just use R packages and they write scripts, and that's completely fine for a lot of sort of analysis workflows. But at some point, you will hit a wall, basically, in terms of how complex your scripts are going to get and how messy they are, and you're going to want to write your own functions that will condense the task that you're trying to accomplish. And so the main reasons for writing your own functions or trying to write your own functions, customization. So you can, by writing your own functions, you can be very specific about the tasks you're trying to achieve in your code, and you can make them very reproducible and shareable. So like if you write a function that achieves a sequence of steps, you can share that code with somebody else and then have them apply their data set and immediately run through that function or set of functions. It also dramatically simplifies your scripts. So for those of you who have a lot of experience writing code, this is going to be totally basic stuff, but for those of you who are less experienced, the point of this part of the talk is really to show you how you might think about using language models to assist you in writing code. It's really not about the code itself, which is going to be very basic. That's because I think that if you master these language models in your data analysis pipelines, it's going to boost you 10 to 100-fold easy. And I'm speaking as a person who, I've been using R for maybe 12, 13 years when these models came along, and so I was pretty advanced in my own understanding of R and coding in general. And I now feel like I'm able to do things that I would never have even previously attempted to do, because they were just like, it's like a kind of thing that's like, I'll have an idea and I'll file it away and I'll never return to it or whatever. But now I just have an idea, and within 10 minutes it's done, and I can just manifest the idea basically in real time. And so it's completely transformed my workflow in terms of the actual scientific questions that I can investigate with code. But you do kind of need to know something to really take advantage of this as an assistant, right? You can't, if you don't know anything about writing code or writing functions, you kind of have to know what to ask, or you kind of have to know what you know and what you don't know to really be able to maximally leverage these tools. That's not to say I think that it is possible to start at a pretty low level. So if you're a beginner, you have a tremendous opportunity here to like dramatically accelerate your learning by using these tools, I think, which is really exciting. But even if you're advanced, more advanced, using these tools, I think, is really, I have friends who are in software development, and they're really resistant to some of these tools. And maybe it's just because I'm more interested in like getting science done that I kind of just want to like, use it as an efficiency boost. And so maybe our mindsets are a little bit different. But yeah, I would highly encourage people to try to do this. So in order to understand how to do this in R, very basic introduction to how do you write a basic R function. If you've done this before, please forgive me, this is not for you. This is for people who haven't done this before. When you're defining a function in R, it uses this very basic structure. I think, I'm going to walk over here because, okay. So variable name, we're deciding that we're going to put our function inside an object called fun, just because it's fun to write functions. This is going to be a global variable, so it's going to be accessible to your R workspace environment when you define it. This operator, this assignment operator, basically just says, okay, we're going to do this thing, and we're going to put it in this other thing. So everything on this side, we're going to do something, and then we're going to store it inside this thing called fun, this object. You use this function. It's a function that defines functions in R, similar to Python. And inside the function, you define what variables you're going to operate on. So this could be one object. It could be a vector. It could be a matrix. You could have multiple objects, whatever you want. You could be arguments for turning things on and off. You then use brackets, this bracket notation, to define the contents of the function. You do some operations on the variables or the arguments that you have. This is not a real function. This is just a placeholder. So you do something inside the function. You then assign it to some value, to some local variable. So this variable only exists inside the function when it's called. It's not going to be deposited into your global environment until you do this return function. So return basically takes this and returns it to your working environment. So this allows you to basically access what the function has done inside your global environment, inside your R working environment. Is that clear, sort of, to everybody, more or less? Is this like, has everyone done this before, or are there people who have never done this before? Has anyone never done this? Don't feel shy. Never done this. Okay, great, at least one person. Okay, so if you know what I'm talking about, great. If you don't, hopefully this will be a useful review. Okay, so some tips. So we're going to, in a moment, I'm going to switch over to R and do a sort of an interactive session. The actual code is going to be very basic, as I said, but the point is I'm going to show you how I've been using this sort of an example of a workflow that I use to assist writing code using language models. The data set we're going to explore is this, at least initially as a group, is this Palmer penguins data set. I'm originally an ornithologist, so of course we're going to use a bird data set that has to do with penguins. It's a nice penguin data set. And then we're going to, really the most, actually this is a really nice, I think this is probably the most useful trick for getting language models to help you with R code, is using this, this structure function that describes the structure of a data object that you might be working with. So for example, I'll show an example of what I mean exactly by this. But this allows you to very easily basically copy and paste and describe the exact structure of the data that you're working with in R to the language model. It gives it a very nice context that makes it extremely easy for you for the model to understand what you're working with. Okay, sort of my data science soapbox thing. Once you start doing complex data analysis projects, I think it's really useful to have at least 2 separate R files, one that has your sort of main primary script, and then a separate file where you define your new functions or classes or whatever. That's a basic computer science thing, but it took me a long time to learn that because I'm not a computer scientist. But this is very helpful. It helps keep you much more organized. I'm not going to really go into that too much, but if that means something to you, great. If it doesn't, that's also fine. It doesn't really matter for this. Okay, so we're going to switch to R now, and I'm going to try to do this without blowing up the system here. Oh, good, it's already there, but I have to mirror this. Oh, that's 1 second. Displays and mirror. Okay. Okay, so. Okay, so here, so I typically use RStudio as an IDE. I don't have I don't have preference on whatever people like to use is totally fine. Do a lot of people here use RStudio or regular R? Or who uses RStudio for R? Oh, everybody. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, it's possible to use this other thing, this VS Code people can use for R. There's other IDEs, but RStudio is great. I have opinions on RStudio, but we can get into that later if people want. So if you download, does everyone have the link to the GitHub repo? That should have been sent out in an email. I think. Was that sent out? Okay. So if you go to that GitHub repo and download the whole repository, I can show that if. Oops. So that's here. Oops. Yeah. So here's the repository. What I would recommend is just download the whole thing. You can go that here and just download the zip file here. Has everyone already done that, or should I give a couple minutes for people to just? Maybe I'll give let's wait 2 minutes and then wait for people to catch up to download the repository. Does anyone need? So the link is just github.com/myname Jake Berv /genai-dataviz. So we'll start back up in like 2 minutes, just to make sure everyone has downloaded this thing. If you don't want to actually replicate this, it's fine to just follow along. That's completely fine. The whole thing. So if you go to code and then download zip here, that'll download the whole thing for you. It should be quite small. So inside here, I just have some R scripts. And then in this supplementary folder, I have some of the PDFs for some of the papers that I mentioned. And then also this example data set, if we have enough time for that, which we may or may not, but we'll find out. So this functions.r file is going to be empty currently. So if it's empty for you, that's fine. The main contents is in this workshop.r file. Okay. So as I said, the actual code I'm going to be demonstrating is quite basic, but the point of this is to sort of go through how I would prompt the language model to help me generate code for data visualization, and how to use some of these tricks for prompting that I think are really valuable. I work mostly in R, but I think a lot of these tricks are probably equally applicable to any programming language or Python, but most people in data science are going to be using R or Python. Maybe Rust if you're on the bleeding edge. But okay, let's get started. So Basically, I'm just going to, so if you open up this workshop.r file in RStudio, I'll give another minute for folks to do that. We're mostly just going to go through this workshop.r file. That has pretty much everything in it that I'm going to walk through. I've cleared out my, so we're starting from scratch here. Is this, maybe I should move, can people see the bottom? I mean, I guess, here, I'll try to make it, I'll make the text larger. That should be helpful. That's too big. Maybe like that. Can people read? Is that big enough to read? Yeah, okay. Okay, so writing functions in R. If you've never done this before, congratulations. This is going to be great. If you have done this before, I apologize. This is just, it's for a general audience. So, okay, so we're going to write our very first R function. And in RStudio, if you don't know this, you can highlight a chunk of text, and then you can click Run, and it'll run that in the sort of R command line, and it'll store this new variable. So now in our environment over here, we have, oh, oops, I still have a bunch of stuff. Let me start over here. Clear this out. Okay, so run this again. Okay, so now, okay, so we've defined our hello function, and here's what it does. It does nothing except if we just run hello, oops, and use this parentheses with no variables, it just says hello, okay? So that's all it does. It just says you have a function. So as I said before, this is just to get an understanding of like what the structure of a function is. It just does one operation. It prints to the screen, prints to your terminal, hello, a string, okay? Here's another a little bit more complicated. We can write a function that takes two objects as an input and then multiplies them together. I haven't done any print statement or return, because if you do this in R, it automatically will just print it. It's not going to return it as an object, but it's going to print it. So if I do AB, and then I can do, if I can put numbers directly into this function, this AB function, this new thing that I've created, and it should return 1 times 5. Or I can do 2 times 5. This also works on vectors or other R objects. So for example, if you define A and B to be 2 vectors, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you can, so now if in our environment we now have these 2 values, which are vectors in R. We can then multiply these, and in R, this type of operation will multiply each element to each other corresponding element in the list, and spits out these values. Let's say you can also, let's say you have, if A here is the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you then do A, 5, it's going to multiply each element in that list by 5. Okay, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So that's your output. We can also we can add plotting to this function, right? So we can say, do this multiplication and then make a bar plot. So this is just using the base R bar plot function. So we're not going to redefine this AB function, and then we're going to run AB, but A and B have already been defined as these 2 vectors. So if I do this and run this code, it's going to spit out a nice bar plot. There we go. Okay. So what I can do now is this gives you, now you've defined this little universe inside this function that does stuff, right? You can say A times 5, and it'll make a plot, or you can do A times B, where B is multiplied by 2 or whatever. You can do this, and it'll give you this plot, right? So by writing these functions, by writing your own functions, you can basically write a recipe that allows you to do can be very sophisticated tasks in one very short little snippet of code. So that's basically functions, writing functions in R. So the primary goal of today's session is basically to learn how to help write these functions specifically for data visualization using language models. And we're going to explore this Palmer Penguins data set. It could be any data set, but this is a really nice one for this kind of exploration. So if you haven't already installed the Palmer Penguins data set, it's a really small R package. I'm just going to load this. You can follow along on your own computer, or you can just follow what I'm doing on the screen. It's totally fine. So this Palmer penguin, let's just explore the data set. Let's see what it looks like. So I'm going to clear this out just for now. Okay, so this is the data set. So penguins. Okay, you can see. So right now, so it's in this tidyverse. People are familiar with tidyverse? The concept of the tidyverse in R, more or less. I'm going to avoid using that today just because it's another dimension of stuff I don't want to have to talk about. So we're going to make it a little bit simpler. Right now it's in this Tibble format, which is a tidyverse version of a data frame. But you can see it has different species of penguins. It has different islands in which the penguins are coming from, and different measurements, and then some other variables that aren't getting printed here. But for our purposes, we're just going to convert this to a regular R data frame, just because it's easier to work with. Okay, first thing, let's say you received a data set for analysis, and you don't know what to do with it, or you're going to start your data science project. But you receive a data set, and you've brought it into R, and now you have an R data frame. So this thing that I mentioned before, this structure function, str, if you run this on the data frame object, oops, I'll make this a little wider, you get this really nice description of what the object actually is. So this is saying, okay, the object is a data frame, 344 observations of 8 variables. It tells you what the variable names are, the column names. It tells you what type of variable they are. In this case, so species is a factor, island is a factor, build depth, numeric, integer, factor, integer. So these are different values, different types of values that can be stored inside an R data frame. This little thing here that I've shown you is probably the most powerful trick for getting language models to do what you want, because you can just copy and paste this object, this output, as part of your prompt, and then the language model will understand exactly what you are dealing with. And so I have found this to be a very useful kind of pro tip for working with for R data frames in language models. And so if by doing this, you don't have to describe what kind of data you're working with. You just say, this is the structure of my data frame, and paste it in. And then the language model will understand what you're dealing with. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically walk through. So I have in this workshop.r file, I have basically the exact text that I gave as a prompt, and then the exact response that I got from GPT-4o, the most recent version that's available. I'm probably not going to switch back and forth between ChatGPT live, just because that's a little bit stochastic. But everything that I've pasted into this workshop.r file is a direct, like verbatim interaction that I had with ChatGPT. So here's an example of what I might do. So very first prompt: I'm working on a new data set in R. I have an R object with the following data structure. Can you tell me about it? Only summarize the data structure. So, and then I just literally paste in the output of this structure object. This is the full prompt for the first prompt. We can try this and see what it does, but just for the sake of argument, I'm going to go through. We can try it later and just see what it spits out. But I think when you're starting with a new data set, this is a very nice first step, because it starts building up context for what you're trying to do within a single session. So by starting it this way, you can start building up this what's called a chain of thought, because it allows you, each time you add another query, it uses all the previous context that you've used in your interaction. Okay, so here's the exact output. This data set is Penguins DF is a data frame in R containing 344 observations and 8 variables. Here's a summary of the data structure. Okay, and it goes through and writes this nice summary. It's making inferences about what this actually represents. So it's saying, it sees that the object, the column name is bill length millimeters. Okay, so it then reads this and assumes it's using the semantic interpolation. It's saying, okay, with the sparse input, I'm guessing that this has to be bill length in millimeters. That information is not in the object, but it's making a guess that that's the case. And in this case, it's perfectly correct. There are some missing values. It goes through and describes this, and it's getting all of this information just from this description of the structure of the object. So if you look closely at this, you can see, yeah, there's some NA values here. There's different types of data here, but it's generating a description of the data set here, right? Okay, so this note. So anytime I have a comment that's like to you guys, to the audience, I've commented it out. That's sort of my narration. And anytime I have a quotation section, that's a prompt section. I don't usually use R Markdown. I apologize, but this should be pretty interpretable. So so let's say we have this description of the data set that we've now told the model about. The description, we notice from the description that they're missing values. Okay, so maybe the first step we want to do is clean the data set. Maybe you might, in an actual data analysis project, you might want to do something more sophisticated, but in this case, let's say we just want to get rid of the rows that have missing values, and we just want to clean up the data set. How do we achieve this? Okay, even if you didn't know anything about R, you didn't know that there was functions in R that can do this very easily, you can just write a prompt and describe what you want. Okay, considering this data frame, I would like to produce a clean version that excludes rows with NA values. Can you help me write an R function that does this? The input will be a data frame containing NA values, and the desired output is a data frame that excludes NA values. Propose a logical solution to this problem and wait for my next response. So in this case, GPT-4 would typically follow this very explicitly. So it'll spit back to you its own interpretation of the prompt, and then it will stop and it won't proceed. But GPT-4o, the new version, is a little bit overeager, and so even if you tell it to wait, it often does not, and will just do the thing before, even if you tell it not to. So just something to know about. This is the newest model that they just released a few weeks ago. I think that they did that because people were complaining that GPT-4 wasn't doing enough work, but I think that they overshot a little bit with this new version. It's kind of doing more than you ask for sometimes, which is sometimes problematic, but that's something to kind of explore. Okay, but this is the function this is the exact function that GPT-4o spit out. Okay, this function is a function it's called clean data. It's a function that operates on a data frame. It comes with annotations, remove rows with any NA values. Okay, it's a very simple function. So in R, there's already this function called NA omit, which will basically do this task already. But say you didn't know that. Say you were new to R, didn't know that that was already in there. You can use the language model and ask it your question in natural language, and it will tell you what to do, even if you don't know the syntax or what's built into R already. Right? So if this was your result, you could say, okay, I don't need to actually write a function. I could just use NA omit. That's fine. But for the sake of argument, we're just going to use this function because that's the point of this. So we're going to run this function or execute this. And now we have this function in our environment called clean data. There it is. And then we're going to use this function to clean our data set. Right? So I'm going to call this new object penguins cleaned. I'm going to run this clean data function that we've just defined. Oops. And then we're going to look at it and just make sure that it worked properly. So I've now run the function, and I put the data frame object inside here as a variable. So penguins cleaned. If we examine the output, okay, now it's a data frame. And if we just scan through this, just visually scanning through, right, there are no NA values, right? I don't see any NA values. Okay, right, so that seems to have worked. If you're doing this in practice, you want to be very careful about this, but this is just, again, an example of how you might do this. When I mean be careful, I mean you have to be careful that the code you get is actually doing what you think it's doing. And that requires that you have to execute some sort of due diligence on your part to, that's why this is an assistant and not a sort of replacement. You have to kind of know, you kind of have to be able to read the code yourself to really be able to understand that it's doing what you think it's doing or not. But if you do understand the code and you can read it, so you have to have that baseline, then it can be an enormous assistant. 10 to 100 times, I think, is conservative. Okay, so let's actually check if all the NA values have been removed. This is just using some very basic R functions. Is NA returns true, false when there's, returns a true when there's an NA and a false when there's not. And then this any function returns, if any of those elements are true, return true. If any of them are false, or any of them are false, it returns false. So if we do this, we get false. Okay, so that means that there are no NA values in the data set. We've cleaned the data set. Okay. Let's say you didn't know this. Let's say you were using R and you didn't know about these functions that are built into R. You say, okay, go back to ChatGPT and say, okay, now help me write an R function and we'll check the data frame for NA values. This will check it to check to see that the other function actually did what you thought it was going to do. So this is kind of like testing the output. So this is the exact output I got from ChatGPT or GPT-4o. This check NA function. Let's just go through it very quickly. Okay, so it's calculating it's basically, it's doing a couple of operations. It's calculating the total number of NA values using built-in R functions, so this is similar, and then it's calculating the total number of NA values for each column, which then generates a summary, and it's going to spit out a list that specifies the total, and then per column values. Okay, this looks like it's fine. And then it's going to return this value, this object, that it's this local variable called NA summary. So it's a nice little function. It's going to check the data frame. So we run this. Oh, I didn't define it yet, so I have to define it. So run this, and then check. Okay, and we get a nice little table here. Total NA values, 0, and then NA per column, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, all good. No NA values confirmed. Okay. So now we have a clean data set, and we want to do something with it. Let's say we want to visualize some of the patterns in the data. A prompt, this is an exact prompt to ChatGPT. I'm interested in how body size varies across different islands. So this is a data set of penguins across different islands, and they have different, and it has metrics for different size aspects, like how big, how long different the flippers are and whatever. But there's multiple sexes, and there are different species in the data set. But we want to parse it out and look at that and visualize that in some interesting way. But maybe we're not really sure what we want to do. So we say, I'm interested in how body size varies across these different islands, accounting for species and sex. So that's telling the model we want to parse out the data set by those variables. Somehow, it's very, very vague. Can you help me come up with some ideas of ways to visualize these patterns? Help me brainstorm. So this is another kind of pro tip. Help me brainstorm. Basically tells the model that you don't want to actually do anything yet. You just want to have it think about the data set or the object, and it's going to spit out some ideas of ways you can interact with it. Okay, here's the exact output. I didn't copy all of them. I just took two of the outputs that it generated. Sure, here are some ideas for visualizing box plots and heat maps, or there's 3 actually, density plot. So body mass by island and species. Create a box plot with body mass on the y-axis, islands on the x-axis, and use different colors to represent species. You can also use facets to separate plots by sex. That sounds cool. Heat maps. Create a heat map where the rows represent islands, etc. Density plots for body mass for each island. These all sound like cool ideas of ways to visualize this data set. Yeah.
I had a question about the prompt. So the keywords that you use, like species and sex, do
Sure.
they have to match exactly what the columns are in the data? Or is it
So,
sort of like say if it's species underscore something or something else?
yeah. So I think that it can figure that out by context. That type of mismatch is kind of a fuzzy mismatch where it's like maybe it's part of the name is in the column, or it has the same meaning. If it's a different word that has the same meaning, it should be able to make those matches pretty well. That I would be you'd want to check that. You'd want to be very careful that it actually does the match correctly. But those types of things, this polysemy, this new word that I learned, where it can figure out the meaning of multiple meanings of words in different contexts, it does that extremely well. So it can parse, often can parse what you want from your prompt, even if you're not super specific about it. In this case, I'm being very specific because it's an example, and I kind of know that I want to be specific. That always helps. You should definitely be as specific as you can be. But it's possible maybe you have an enormous data frame and you don't know, yeah, so you can use this as a way of brainstorming and try to see what is going on. Okay, so it gave us some ideas for visualizations. My next prompt, this is in the sequence of the same chat. I like the idea of box plots, and then I just copy and paste the exact same thing that it generated. I just changed the tenses a little bit. Create a box plot with body mass, islands on the y, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm specific. The input data will be the cleaned penguin data frame. This is important because in the same chat, in the same context, it knows when you say this, it means you're referring to something that you already that should be in that context window already, right? And so if you refer to something, it should be able to match that to what if it's in the same context window, it should be able to match that to what you're talking about. And then this links it to everything it knows about that data frame because you've already described as part of your prompt the exact structure of that object. So it knows exactly what that object looks like. Okay, so here we go. This is the actual output that I got from ChatGPT. Okay, so what it's doing, okay, there's a little bit of redundancy here. This is what I meant with 4. So GPT-4 wouldn't always do this, but 4.0 tends to do this a lot, where if within a single chat context, it sometimes it tries a little too hard. And so this you wouldn't actually need, this cleaning section, because we've already done that step. But it seems that 4.0 doesn't seem to, sometimes doesn't quite get that right. But so that's not necessary, but it doesn't hurt anything. Okay, so now we're defining colors for the different species. If you wanted to, you could change this to be user arguments for the function. This is now going to split up. It's going to identify the unique factors in this column called sex, and then it's going to go through and do a for loop and plot the box plots for each of these things by sex and by island. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. Let's see if it worked. Okay, so let's make this. I'm going to have to make this bigger here. Let's see. Oh, let's try again. Oops. Okay, here we go. Of course, it's not going to work because it's a live demo, but okay, there we go. Okay, so data visualization in R with language model assistance. There we go. Okay, so we've now visualized this data set. So what's going on here? Is this super interpretable? It's a little bit messy. It's not super clean. That's normal. When you start out doing this, you're going to get things that look kind of messy. But did it plot the data correctly? Maybe. We're not entirely sure. You can see that it's here. Let me zoom in or zoom out, I guess. Okay, so here we've got, that's a little more clear. Okay, so it's created a legend for us, but it's overlapping. We'd want to change that. This is this is the direct output from GPT-4o. Exactly the output, right? And it's plotting, okay, so it got the body mass on the y-axis, that looks correct. And it's splitting up the penguins by different islands. So you can see that it's sort of parsing the data correctly, right? So it's doing, okay, here's Gen 2 penguin on this island, chinstrap penguin on this island. So each row, each column here is basically, it's rearranging the data set and pulling out the different elements of the data. And these rows these columns that are empty maybe are rows that don't have any data for that combination, right? Okay, so maybe that's something. Maybe we're going in some direction here, but it's like not a great visualization. It's kind of hard to interpret. Then again, it is something. So if you didn't have any knowledge about R, you could generate something here that you can sort of work with. Okay, so it's not super intuitive. Let's think about this in another way. Oops. Here's the next. Oops. Oh yeah, here's the next prompt that I gave it. In this sequence, I think it would be interesting to visualize the distributions of specific traits across different islands, considering year, sex, and species as user-specified options. That means that I want to write a function that has user flags that I can manipulate as a user, right? The input will be the clean data frame and user options for year, sex, and species. The function should use box plots, base R, to show the trait distributions across islands. So this is a much more specific prompt, and we're continuing to build up this sort of chain of thought in the sequence of prompts that we're using. I'm specifying base R because our GPT-4 and 4o like to use tidyverse and ggplot. You can do that if you like. If you like to use that, just feel free to do that. I try to use, when I'm writing functions, I try to avoid that because it ends up being, when I write functions, I want them to be as globally accessible as possible. So if you end up using tidyverse code inside your functions, then that requires a lot of dependencies, and someone else has to load a lot of other packages to be able to use that. So if I'm writing new functions, I try to use base R. I also kind of prefer the base R syntax, but that's just me. A lot of people prefer tidyverse, and that's fine. But anyway, if you don't specify this, it will often use the tidyverse code. And so if you want to use base R, you often have to specify that. Okay, so this is not, so this was a little bit more of a challenge, and I don't have every single prompt, every single interaction here, but only 2 or 3 interactions where I had the correct, very minor things, and it generated this function that has a lot of options. Okay, so I'll go through this. Okay, so now we have a new function. So I didn't write any of this code. This is all 100% written by GPT-4o with some minimal prompting. But this is the main prompt. Okay, so we have a new function that's going to create box plots for us. And it named this create trait box plots. It takes the data frame, clean data frame, the specific trait that you want to visualize, the year, the sex, the species, and then I also added this parameter. I asked it to add this parameter for the y-axis limits because it made it easier to compare things if everything was on a consistent y limit. Okay, so it filters the data, checks the data set that it's cleaned again. This is probably not necessary, but as I said, it's a little bit overeager, so it does this extra step here. It identifies the unique levels for the islands, starts to create the box plots. This is actually creating, it's building up the specific formula that will be called by the box plot function in R. And it knows, based on the context of what I've asked for, exactly how to set that up. And it's even going to create a customized title for us. Each time we call the function with different user arguments, it's going to make a customized main text title. And then it actually plots the box plot here using all these previous steps that it's built up. So let's actually let's see what this does. Okay, if I define this function in the workspace, oops, clear this out, and here we go. Okay, so let's now ask. Okay, do the sizes of these different penguins change over time? Let's say that's our question. We want to know, like, is there any pattern in how the body size changes over time? Maybe we don't know anything about our code or just getting started. But now we've created a new function that's going to allow us to visualize this very easily. So in this case, I've specified, here's the data frame, here's the trait of interest, the year, the sex. Let's say we're going to look at females. This is the specific species we want to look at, and then the Y limits are just the for consistent Y limit axis. And let's see what it does. Does this even work at all? Okay, voila, box plots. Okay, what this is telling us is that there's some individuals on this island called Dream. It has some variation, but these penguins don't occur on those other two islands. So immediately we know useful information just from the data set, right? This is again it's a very simple example, but you can imagine if you had a gigantic data frame and you wanted to quickly explore some aspects of this data frame. This approach could potentially be quite useful, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with R. Okay. Let's look at, okay, so this is for the year 2007. Let's look at the year 2008. Okay, so now the title has changed. You can see up the title changed automatically. Oh yeah, now my mouse is working. Okay, so this is all being updated automatically. So if you wanted to generate some reports for somebody, this is a very easy way to do this. Automatically it's all labeled. It tells you the trait of interest, the trait that's being plotted, and here's your visualization. Okay, let's look at 2009. And something, so okay, so not much is changing here. Let's look at these plots. Okay, so it's pretty similar, right? Not too different. So maybe the variance is changing a little bit, but the median is sort of stable. Okay, maybe what about male penguins? Let's just change the function to ask for male penguins. All you have to do is change this to male, but because we've created our own function, we can achieve all of those steps just by changing one little parameter. And we see, okay, the males, in this case, 2007, a little bit bigger than females. Let's try the next one, 2008. A little bit more of a fluctuation. And then again, for 2009. There we go. Okay, so the power here is just to sort of, like the point here is just to sort of demonstrate that like functions are very valuable. And if you define your own functions, you can do these very quick manipulations of your data set very easily without having to define, for each one of these things, you don't have to have a script that parses the data separately, right? You can just write a function and then define whatever arguments you want to change, and see how your data set changes very easily. Okay, maybe the males. Okay, so maybe the males in this case are a little bit bigger, but our plot is missing penguins from these other islands. So how do we? Maybe we want to find out what other penguins are, like what islands have penguins on all three islands, or what penguins occur on all three islands. Okay, so we go back to ChatGPT and we say, okay, remind ourselves. Here's the structure of the object. Okay, so here's this object, the initial data set. We can see that it's multiple rows. The species are coded in rows, but it's kind of all jumbled up. And, oops. Yeah, okay, so prompt, a direct quote. I want to know what species occur on all islands. And this is the exact output that GPT returned in terms of code. Okay, it knows, okay, we're gonna build a contingency table that describes exactly what I want. So this is again a simple demonstration, but it's just showing you this sort of workflow of how do you interact with the language model. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Oh no, yeah, species island table, oops. Okay, nice contingency table. Okay, so Adelie penguins Bisco, Dream, Toggerston. Okay, they looks like they occur on, this species occurs on these 3 islands. Chinstrap is only on Dream. Okay, that's what we're looking at here in this plot. Gen 2 penguins only on Bisco. Okay, so that's immediately, we're getting some useful information. It also spit out this thing, which is not really necessary, but if you want to, this will basically just query this new table, and it should return whichever species has penguins on all 3 islands. Okay, Adelie penguins. So now we know there are Adelie penguins on each island. But let's go back to our function and change the species to Adelie penguins, and we're going to just visualize. I added this function. This just sets up the plotting space, and we're going to make three separate plots using the GPT-4o code. Okay, so now this is a little bit more useful. Okay, so now we've generated 3 different plots side by side, and we can easily sort of just visualize these to sort of build our intuition about what's going on in this data, right? And it's already all labeled for us, 2007, 2008, 2009. Species is the same, and it's telling you for different islands. So this all looks good, right? I mean, if this was what you were trying to visualize in the first place, this is close to like done, right? It maybe doesn't look so nice, but it's like you've generated data visualization, and you didn't write any code, right? You didn't have to do this. You could prompt ChatGPT to do this. Okay, let's try something more sophisticated. We're running low on time, so we're probably not going to get to the actual interactive challenges. Maybe I'll stick around after if people want to try. But this will be useful to really demonstrate. Okay, let's say we want to know something more sophisticated. Let's say we want to take multiple measurements from inside that data set, and we want to look at their relationships to each other. We want to fit some linear models, and we want to look at how those linear models might be different across different species, for example. So again, let's remind ourselves of what this data object looks like. It's got these, okay, so it's species islands, and then we have these multiple different types of measurements: bill depth, bill length. Let's say we want to, if our biological question is maybe, what's the relationship between bill length and flipper length? But we want to compare this across different species, right? So that means, okay, so that's saying we want to fit a simple linear model, bill length versus flipper length, and we want to see what that looks like for different species. So in this session, or for this next sequence, I've started from a completely fresh ChatGPT session, so it doesn't have any of the prior context. Again, just to show you how to build up this context prompt again. So again, I've given it, I say I'm working with an R data object that looks like this, copy paste the structure in, and then here's my initial query. I want to know what the relationship between bill length and flipper length looks like, but I want to compare this across species. I want to write an R function that takes the input data object, so that's referring to this thing that I've already provided, and user arguments for pairs of specific traits. So this is making the function general. So this means I want a function that's going to take any combination of these columns, so bill length, flipper length, bill depth, whatever's in here. Right? I want to be able to, in my function, specify the specific names of the traits I want to compare, so I can easily replicate this for different combinations. The function will filter the data set by species, fit linear models to each pair of traits, then it will plot a scatter plot of the results per species with each species as different colored points. Okay, I have a spelling error here. That didn't, it understood that perfectly well, even though I had a spelling error. Lastly, we'll add the inferred regression lines from the model fits. Okay, first thing I do, when I have a multi-step task like this, I try to give it this kind of a prompt at the end. Ensure you understand the task. Explain it back to me before proceeding, and I will check your logic. This is very, very helpful. And with GPT-4, it used to just follow that very strictly and would not proceed. With 4.0, sometimes we'll do that and then proceed more, which is not always desirable, but your mileage will vary on that. But this, whenever I'm doing a complex, something that's a little bit more complex, which involves multiple steps, I always ask it to ensure that it understands and to explain it back to me step by step, because then that gives me the opportunity to review step by step exactly the sequence of operations that it's going to try to incorporate into the function. And oftentimes it will get it right. Sometimes one of the steps will be wrong, and then that's your opportunity to say, no, this is actually, step 3 is not what I want. This is what I want. And then you say, repeat it back to me again. And then once you have a full sequence of steps that is correct, then you say, do the task. And that often generates results that are much more usable. Okay, so here's a breakdown. Okay, so here's the exact copy-paste output. Certainly here's a breakdown of the task. Input, our data frame, function and filtering and modeling. The function will filter the data set by species. For each species, it will fit a linear model to a specified pair of traits. Examples, okay. Plotting, create a scatter plot showing the relationships, different colors for each point, add regression lines inferred from linear models. Function definition, create a function that takes the data frame and 2 trait names as input arguments. So that's 3 input arguments. Data filtering. Within the function, filter the data by species and then fit linear models, simple linear models, and then generate a plot. Okay, so this looks perfectly correct to me, step by step. In the actual output, it was numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, but when I pasted it in, the numbers got erased, but for some reason. But anyway, this is your opportunity to actually make sure that it understands exactly, that it has interpreted your prompt correctly. So it's really, when you're using this to interact with, or to help you write code, this is super helpful. Especially if you're trying to get it to do something that is more sophisticated than just a very simple task, right? Okay, so this looks perfectly correct, so I didn't need to change any, I didn't need to say, no, you were wrong, I need to fix this. Okay, so my next prompt, okay, this looks good to go ahead and write the R function, use base R. Again, I'm saying use base R because this is a new session, and often it will try to use tidyverse, which I try to avoid sometimes. Okay, so here's the function that it wrote verbatim. Okay, so it checks. So one thing that's wonderful about this is that it knows all these wonderful like coding best practices already. You don't have to tell it to do any of this stuff. So it like checks to make sure that the data has what it's supposed to have. It builds this in automatically, ensure the traits actually exist in the data set. Great. Define colors for species. So this is it's making choices here. You could go in and change this, or you could add these as additional user arguments. Setting up the plotting space. Adding a legend, and then looping through, writing here a for loop that goes through 4 species. So we're going to do a separate plot for each species in these different levels. This all looks fine. We're going to fit a linear model, simple linear model for each data set as it's going through this for loop. We're going to get predictions for the regression line, and then plot this online. This looks generally okay. Okay, so let's see what it does. Okay, so I'm going to define this, and I'm going to plot this. Clear this out. Okay, let's try again. Okay, error. This is intentional. So you will see this a lot. If you're writing code with ChatGPT, you'll copy a function or copy some piece of code, and it'll run it, and it'll do some of what you asked. Maybe it'll blow up and spit out an error, and it's not going to be perfectly correct, right? But it looks like it got part of the way correct. In this case, it's plotting flipper length against bill length, so we've specified those 2 traits as our things that we're interested in, but it didn't plot the regression lines, it didn't fit the models. So something has gone wrong. So in this case, it appears that in the sequence of steps that's being followed by the function, it got the plotting right, but as soon as it started fitting the models, something went wrong. If you don't understand what this error means, you go back to ChatGPT and you say, I got an error. Here's the exact error that I got. It looks like the error, and if you can provide some context to where you think the error is occurring, that's great, because that'll help it troubleshoot. So in my case, I know it seems like it plotted, but it didn't plot the regression line, so I think the error is occurring in the model fitting because the initial plotting seems to work correctly. I could have been more specific. Can you check this section if you see an error corrected? Otherwise, can you add debug statements to help me troubleshoot? This is also super powerful. If you end up writing something more sophisticated and you have trouble getting it to actually do what you want, ask it to add print statements that debug the code. So as you run your function, it'll print out the results of each section, or whether or not it achieved some section, and then you can use that to sort of pinpoint where the error might be occurring. This is a normal debugging strategy, but with ChatGPT, it'll do that automatically for you, or it can do that for you. Okay, so I'm not showing you every single step here in this case, but this is the strategy you would use. You would basically, if you don't understand the error yourself, spit the error back and provide some context if you can, and send it back to ChatGPT and ask it to help troubleshoot. Okay, so it did that a few times, a couple back and forth, and then it generates this new version. In this case, here's the revised version. In this case, it's quite similar. The only thing that's different is this section at the bottom where it's fitting models. Instead of using the predict function and trying to predict new values for points on the model, it's just using this abline function in R, which basically just reads the regression model coefficients and plots the line with slope and intercept. So that's much simpler than what it was doing before. I as an R user, I know that as a solution. Beforehand. And so if you have some experience with R and you kind of know a different solution, you can just be, you can say, I think this might be getting confused on this part. Try this other approach, and it'll build a function that will do that or try to do that. So in this case, let's run it again. And in this case, we're just going to give it this data frame that's been cleaned again. We're going to specify these 2 traits we want to examine. Let's see if it works. Okay, cool. So that seems to, let's try again. It was still in the error from the previous one. Let's try again. Oh no, it's because I forgot to redefine this. What did I do? There we go. Yeah, okay, so we've got our different clusters, our 3 different species, the relationships between these 2 traits in the data set and these regression lines. This seems like it works. It kind of looks like the model fits, the regressions, the slopes are a little bit, the slopes and intercepts are different for these different species. That's potentially interesting if you're a biologist. This could be any kind of data set, doesn't matter, it's just penguins for an example. Maybe you're trying to fit linear models, or it doesn't have to be linear models, any kind of models. You might, logistic regression, whatever. But you've maybe learned something from the data set, right? This is potentially cool. It looks like, so what this has done is instead of returning, so it printed out as it was running. These are print statements that the code added. So it's printing out these different, it's parsing out the data for different species. It's printing out the data sets, and then it's printing out the model output for these different things. Excuse me. So, but this is just being printed. It's not being saved anywhere. But maybe you want to actually statistically compare these different models. So let's make a different prompt. Okay, this function works, and then insert the code of the working function. That's important. I'm not pasting it here just for being concise in this presentation. Give it, so you can be repetitive. It's always good to be as specific as you can each time you prompt. But this time, we want to modify the function so that plotting is turned on and off with a user flag, and then it also returns the model fits as a list of objects. This is really valuable when you're doing analyzing data and you want to be able to save the model fitting output to something you can manipulate later. I think this worked perfectly on the first shot when I did this, and this is the code that it generated. So now we have a flag here that's plot equals true, so that's going to be plotting turned on by default. But now we've created this function that does all these nice things, and in addition, it returns a list of objects that contains the actual model fits. So this is useful because then we can do further manipulations on those model fits as objects if we want to, in addition to plotting. Okay, so let's run this code, and in this case we're going to run this same thing, plotting turned on, but in this case we're going to assign the output to a new object called model fits because we want to save that output. We'll run that. It's going to print again. It doesn't really matter. But now let's examine the output, this model fit object. Oops. Okay, so here's the object. Oops. And if you know how to use, if you know this R syntax. Okay, so now we have this nice R object for the different species. ChatGPT made these decisions for us to label them this way, but this seems really nice. So now we can query this. Oops. Yeah, so now we have these model fit objects in a nice little list that we can further analyze, whatever you want. Okay, so this is a useful thing to do if you're doing this kind of work. Okay, that's actually, okay, we're at 11:52. That's actually the main workflow that I wanted to sort of share with you guys. There is a section here that I have in this data challenges section where I have, okay, so if you go over to this data challenges.r, maybe if you didn't know this, R has a bunch of built-in data sets just for testing purposes. So if you're in R and you type data, this data function, you get this list of, it has all these different data sets that are built in. I wanted to come up with some more fun things as challenges for you guys. So if you go all the way down here, this is just a list of the data sets. So I have some challenges here. One set of challenges using the sort of classic, this is a data set called the MT cars data set, which is a classic R example data set. It's a data set of different types of car like statistics. So it's like, so it has like, for different cars, miles per gallon, cylinder displacement, horsepower, all this kind of stuff. And so I have challenges inside here for whatever level you might be at. If you go in here, here's the challenge. So we'll do a fuel efficiency analysis. Write a function to visualize the relationship between number of cylinders and miles per gallon, provide insights on what cylinder configuration offers the best fuel efficiency. Requirements, the function should create a box plot or violin plot to show the distribution of miles per gallon. and so on. So there are different levels here. The advanced challenge is going to asking you to do some cluster analysis on the data set. The second data set is a data set that I found from Spotify. It's one of these Kaggle data challenge data sets. It's pretty fun. It has data like on the top 10 songs for the last decade and different aspects of those songs. So like the beats per minute, the danceability, the loudness, lots of cool variables. And again, 3 different challenges here. So we don't have a lot of time left. I'll stick around for 20 minutes or so if people want to stick around. Don't feel compelled to. If anyone wants to try to tackle one of these challenges using the prompting techniques that I've shown, that's great. If you guys just want to talk or chat about anything I've said or anything about the pipeline or the strategy that I've shown, happy to do that or answer questions at this point. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got for you guys. Thanks. Yeah. Maybe questions first. Yeah, go for it.
I saw that you said something about making a flowchart.
Oh yeah, this is very cool. This is one I saved this for the very end. I can show a demo of this if people want it. So this is like one of the coolest things. So if you have like a complex R function, and you want to create, let's say you're doing a research project that involves writing new code, and you want to create a visualization of like what your code is doing. I just discovered this a few weeks ago. Let's take, I'll do an example. This is worth showing quickly if we want. Let's go back to the, okay. You know what? I actually did have another example here at the end with ridgeline plots. But since we're out of time, yeah, so if folks want to go through the end of the workshops there's another example using ggplot and making a ridgeline plot, which is an aesthetic that I like. But it gets a little bit more sophisticated. So if you want to go through that on your own, that's cool. But the thing at the very end is about how to visualize. You can use it to, so ChatGPT understands this programming language called mermaid code, which I didn't know existed until a few weeks ago. But it's a very simple, not even a programming language, it's just like a syntax for making flowcharts. And so one very kind of neat thing that you can do with it is you can take, like, let's say we have, I'll go back to one of the functions that we built earlier. Okay, here we go. Yeah, let's take, maybe let's use, let's use the penguin one that we did for the box plots. Maybe this one? Yeah, this is the one that does the, oh no, that's a little bit further along. Model fits, yeah, this is the one. Okay, yeah, so this is the one with the 3. Okay, so let's say plot trait relationships. Okay, so let's say this is the function we want to visualize. Okay, so let's just copy this so we have it in our, oops, this will be an actual live demo using ChatGPT. Okay, this is going to be relatively simple here. Okay, so this is, if you want to visualize how your code works in a nice way, this is just an example. Okay, so I have this R function I've been working on. Can you help me write mermaid code to visualize a flow, I'm spelling wrong, but flowchart. And then just paste in your script. This is using 4.0, so we'll see how it works. It should be pretty fast. Oops. Assuming it's going to work at all. There we go. Okay. So this is the code that we just built to visualize the penguin data set. Okay, mermaid code. Okay, mermaid diagram to visualize the flowchart of your function. So in my work, I've been working on developing new statistical methods for the types of data that I work with, and so this is very useful because I end up writing these very complex functions that do many dozens of tasks, complex model fits, and moving things around. And anyway, but this is a nice. So what you do is you take this output. So what it's doing is that it's looking at the code and it's constructing this diagram of like flows from steps from A to B, and different linkages and how things move around. It's also adding labels from what it's interpreting from the code. So let's see if this actually works. This is a live demo, so it probably won't, but I think it's mermaid.live. Yeah, okay. So if you go to mermaid.live, paste in your flowchart, and then you have to examine this to see if it actually works, if it's actually correct, but this is a kind of a very cool way of like visualizing. Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so here we go. So it's like a nice flow chart describing what your code is doing. Is this on there? Yeah. Okay, so start, ensure traits or data. So yeah, this looks traits present, so it's initializing an empty list, plotting, set up the plot, looping through species. So yeah, if you end up writing a lot of R functions, and you say if you're coming up with some, like say if you're writing like a new statistical method and you want to be able to like explain how it works to, this is like a great, you could like include this as like a figure in your publication or something, just as a neat way of visualizing what the code does. Yeah, that's what I meant by the visualizing. It's just, yeah. So I haven't explored this too much, but it's super fun. And sometimes it doesn't get it quite right, but you can, it gives you 90% of the way there to get you there, get you something that's like usable. This is a relatively simple function, but like if you end up writing functions that are more complex or doing more complex operations, this also can be a really nice way of like actually visualizing whether or not the function is doing what you think it's doing, right? So like if you see something on here that's like, wait a second, that's not right, you should definitely go back and check your code to make sure it's not actually, that it's, maybe there's a mistake in the translation to the flowchart versus an actual mistake in your code. So you can use this as a way of troubleshooting as well. Yeah, anyway, that's basically all I got. If you want to try the data challenges and generate some interesting output, please feel share it with me, and I'll take a look at it if you want, or try it on your own to see how it works. You should be able to do all of these beginner, intermediate, and advanced. You should be able to tackle all of these using the techniques that I've talked about today, basically. Yeah. Yeah, that's all I got. Thanks for your attention.